Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Tools and Data for Resilience training. I'm Allie Rellinger, and I'm from Mississippi State University in the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant. And I'm here today with Kiama Williams, and we're going to be talking about all different kinds of tools and data for your resilience needs. This workshop here today is part of our Coast Resilience Institute here at the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant. We've been doing all kinds of in-person and online trainings around resilience topics that were driven by y'all and what you guys told us that you guys needed to help move this forward. So today we're going to talk about this really important and needed topic that there's just a lot of information out there. So we hope that this webinar today helps you guys wade through some of this and find those tools and data that you need to do resilience work. So first and foremost, let's talk about why we're here. So why and when would you need maps or demographic data in your work for resilience? So there's a lot of different reasons. So we're going to explore a few of those just so that we all fully understand the why and when to use this before we actually start getting into the tools that you can use. The big one is that tools are becoming required. Whether we like it or not, there's a lot of ask to specifically use tools as we develop proposals, as we pick projects and things of that nature. So example here that we see a lot around things like Justice 40 and the EPA. And so what we've seen with stuff like this is that there's an explicit ask that we use the EPA's EJ Screen to provide some of this information to characterize and describe target communities and where this data should come from. So a lot of times we're seeing specific tools that should be used in the development of a proposal. But that gets us to an even bigger question that we hear a lot of times. So what even are tools? People use this word tool in a lot of different ways, and they often mean a lot of different things. So we've tried to break down what different kind of tools exist out there. So the first is demographic tools or mapping tools. These two things are kind of similar in a lot of ways. They have a similar primary function. That's to help us access and use information more easily. So some sort of visualization. They are shaped by what type of information is available and how it's actually used. And a lot of times you'll see a very similar function or format and oftentimes similar information contained within these. We can further break this down into how you might use a tool. So there's kind of three bins we can put these in. These can be planning tools. This can be in the development phase of things where you are planning for something, and this is on the front end. There also are tools for communicating, that the point of them is to share data oftentimes and communicate some results of a project or some metrics for people to look at. Then last is for decision making. So that is a little bit different than the planning process. So this might be a decision making tool that gives you your different options under different scenarios so that a decision maker can decide between two or more end goals here. Now, especially because we are talking about resilience, that we're talking about a lot of climate data, a lot of demographic data, we might be talking about past conditions. Are we talking about what was historically there? Is this the historical population or economic trends? Is it the historical flood patterns? Or are we talking projecting into the future, which is really important as we're making climate resilience decisions, like what do we expect those future conditions to look like? But also with a lot of the things around demographics, like what are the population projections, things like that. Are we forecasting into the future? So you might see the past, you might see the future. Some tools may have both. So then when we talk about the climate resilience tools, there could be a lot of different types of climate data. A lot of times around here, we are focused on flooding because that is just a huge hazard in our coastal communities. So that's a big one. But climate data could also include things like rainfall. And then also we're hearing a lot more about heat and rising temperatures. So the access to tools that can show us that kind of data. So that's just the ones that are probably the most relevant to us in coastal Mississippi and Alabama. Now, we talk about the type of information contained within. There's this idea of demographic data. The demographic data can really mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So a lot of times we think of some of these boxes, but not others. So age, race, those are common demographics that people associate with this. But demographic data can include a lot of other things: education levels, income levels, language access, vehicle usage, exposure risk. There's all kinds of things that might be considered and encapsulated in demographic data. And depending on the source, you might get more of these than others. So it's not just as granular as things like age or race, but it can be a lot of different factors that could be included in there. So then we can get into how is this communicated? A lot of times I think when people think tools, we're thinking mapping tools. These are visualizations that show us, you know, the landscape, and we're looking at the different towns and they're overlaying this data in some sort of way. And that is a really common type of tool. We are going to look at a bunch of different mapping tools today as part of this training, but that isn't the only kind of tool we need. This could also be a lot of different types of reports are considered tools that might provide the appropriate data for your needs in there. And then there's also tools that actually show you analyses or allow you to perform some sort of analyses where you get to manipulate information a little bit and get some sort of outputs out of it. So this can come in all different ways. So we just don't want people to get really boxed into thinking a tool has to be something really specific. There's a really broad definition here, and it really depends on what you need and what you're getting out of that. So hopefully today we can help you figure out how to narrow down and find the right type of tools, get you the right type of information that you need. So I want to go a little bit more into demographic tools because we do get a lot of questions about this because of things like the Justice 40 executive order and needing to convey a lot more of this information. We've had a lot of conversations with people that are just looking for access to this type of data because they haven't had as much experience with it or are just confused by the overwhelming amount of demographic data and tools that are out there. So as a reminder, when we're saying demographics, it could be anything along the bottom here: age, race, education, income, exposure risk, language, vehicles, all these sorts of things could be in our demographic tools. So most of the demographic data that we cite comes from things like the census and the American Community Survey data. This is not just found in one place. So this is where things can get confusing. You can find census and American Community Survey data in a lot of different tools. So don't be surprised when you find the same thing showing up in different types of tools. But that is, in the United States, a major driver of this kind of demographic information. So you will see it in a lot of places. One of the most common things that we see in there is the Social Vulnerability Index. So what is an index? If you're not familiar with this idea of an index, this is where we combine different measures or indicators into a single number. And we can do this a lot of different ways because you can have all these factors that play into a question you're trying to answer, and they can have different importance or weights within that index. And then that allows us to give us a single number. So the Social Vulnerability Index would give us a number for a different community, and that allows us to do things like comparisons. This is quick. This lets us compare things. Comparing, if we have this standard metric for doing this, then we know that we can easily compare community A to community B. And we're going to look at some examples of these because indices are becoming such a strong component of a lot of these tools, and making sure that we have a good understanding of how to use them. So, like I said, there are a lot of indices out there. So we're going to keep covering some of the more common ones, but don't be surprised because they keep showing up in a lot of different ways these days. So you can index your data together for a lot of different purposes. In addition to demographic tools, we see indices for all types of environmental and climate data as well. So we're going to focus on demographics right now, but no similar conversation for environmental issues, and you might find an environmental index for a lot of the things you're working on. But like I said, you have to understand your index in order to use it in an informed way in your work. So whether you're planning, decision making, or communicating, with your tools. You want to make sure that you understand what goes into an index that you're using and then how you can apply it for those types of comparisons. An index can also be really helpful to help pull out specific information about a community. And a lot of times this data comes in multiple formats. So we're going to focus on the demographic index, and we're looking here at things we see in EJ Screen. Since EJ Screen gets called out a lot as something to be used by the EPA and a lot of different agencies now. So this is one that we see cited a lot. So the demographic index is a really simple index. It has two factors that we're going to be considering. And so you can see here where they give you a full definition of this index. You should be able to find a definition for an index on any tool that uses an index. So when we get into looking at some of these tools, you'll be able to see where the info buttons are and things where you would find this type of information. But when we get into that, we see here in this text that the demographic index is % people of color and % low income divided by 2. So everything is weighted the same, and we're just, dividing it by 2 to come up with a simple number that takes into account these two important factors and allows us to make quick assessments of the community. Then we have the supplemental demographic index. The supplemental demographic index is specifically named in the Justice 40 executive order. So this is one that people are being asked to cite a lot. This one's a little more complex. It takes the basis of that demographic index and it adds more factors. So the supplemental now has 5 socioeconomic factors that are included in it. So we take the 2 that came from the demographic index. So we have, and then we add some others. So now we have low income, unemployed, less high school education, limited English speaking, and low life expectancy divided by 5. You'll see things are still, weighted similarly, and you'll have an average of these factors. So this is encapsulating more information into a similar demographic index. But you want to know if you're using these, what are the factors, what all was included, because these have different data going into them. So, like I said, there's other types of indices. The other one that does come up a lot is this CDC's driven social vulnerability index. It's an even more complex index where they have 16 census variables that are included in it. And so that's going to, pull in even more nuance than some of these other ones. So before we started hearing a lot about supplemental demographic index because of things like the Justice 40 initiative, we heard a lot about social vulnerability index. Social vulnerability index is still widely used, so it's another one to really be aware of. In addition to the demographic indices that we talked about, there's a whole bunch of other supplemental indices that are included in things like EJ Screen. So now we have all of these particular environmental hazards that are then crosswalked with the socioeconomic information. So now we're starting to merge environmental climate things with demographics. And so you can get all of these supplemental indices in EJ Screen related to all of these EPA regulated environmental indicators like particulate matter, ozone, lead paint, all of this stuff. So these also exist. And so you can go into those and look explicitly at how they're calculated. So a note about demographic data, because one thing that we've seen happen repeatedly is that it often gets applied incorrectly. So we've talked about when we're looking at index data, understanding your indice and how to compare it, but also just looking at the numbers themselves and how they're presented when you look at individual factors is something of concern. So there's multiple different ways we might see data come out. The first is the most basic. It is our raw numbers, our actual or statistical counts of something. We then often see things presented as a percentage. This means we are taking a raw number and comparing it to a percent total. So like out of your total population, or things like that. Then we get into percentile. And this is where a lot of the confusion sometimes lies in people using this information. Percentage and percentile are not interchangeable. A percentile indicates how that percentage or raw number compares to other places. So this is allowing us to then move between communities, census tracts, whatever scale we're looking at, and compare places to each other. So I'm going to go through a more specific example to make sure that this is clear. So for example, a raw number, we could say 1,000 people in census tract A do not have access to broadband internet. Okay, so that's a raw number. That is the exact amount of people. And for some things that you might be doing, that might be what you need. You want to know exactly how many people you would be serving. If you're writing a proposal to provide access to people, you know, then having that count would be something really useful to you. Now, if we want to look at percentages, we then find out that this translates to 13% of people in census tract A do not have access to broadband internet. So this really changes the way we're framing things. If we just look at percentage, we don't know how many total people that is, but now we have a idea of the scale within the community. So we have a lot or a few people who are missing broadband in relation to the rest of the population in that area. So now we have a little more context for what does that 1,000 people really mean? Is that a lot or a little in this community? Last but not least, when we translate this percentile, we find out census tract A is in the 89th percentile in the US of people who do not have access to broadband internet. Now, this is allowing us to contextualize things to other places. So if we just look at that 1,000, that might seem like a lot or it might seem like a little to people, depending on their frame of reference and how much they know about this community. And that 13%, same thing. But the percentile gives us this idea that, hey, if you don't know anything about this, and if that is a lot or a little, we're actually now learning because of percentile. If we can do the same comparison across all of our census tracts, that 89, that they are having low access to broadband internet. So 89th percentile means 89%, 89 compared to all the other census tracts in broadband access. So this means that this community doesn't have as much access to broadband internet as other places in the United States. So depending on what you're doing here, do you need to know the exact amount of people who don't have broadband internet access for your planning because you're writing a grant and you want to know how many services you're going to provide? Or are you trying to show in comparison to your community or the rest of the United States? And so you can use these different metrics, and it's the same data driving this, but used in different ways. But you don't want to mix these up because they are not interchangeable with each other. So that is our word of warning, just to think through. It can be a little confusing sometimes because the percentage and percentiles may look the same, and it can be easy to gloss over, and you'll be looking at a percentile when it's really a percentage or vice versa. So we just want to be careful. So lastly, other words of warning. Demographic data from our experience is not as well understood in things. So, you know, we don't necessarily recommend even thinking that your grant reviewers and the people who are going to read a proposal will understand the context of your demographic data. So just putting the raw numbers alone doesn't often get the job done. So we strongly suggest that you try to use guidance and context, that you write these things so that people can see these comparisons. So, you know, example here, 20% of the county is below the poverty line compared to the US average of 13%. We're getting guidance and context so that people reading this understand how you're interpreting the demographic data. And then we can also provide more information on what that means. So example here, 9% of our residents don't speak English and 11% do not have access to a vehicle. Then the information on what that means is in our region, these factors can be significant barriers to, and then you go on from there. So we are strongly urging you not to just present the demographic data as standalone, but just think about how you're going to contextualize this and provide information on what that means. Because while it may be obvious to you in that community, it might make more sense to other people to make sure that you provide information so that if they don't know this place as well as you do, that you make this make sense and help craft your story or what you're trying to communicate. So with that, we are gonna start thinking about some of our tools a little bit more in our mapping tools and such. So we do have a ton of types of tools that cover a wide array of topics. This can include demographic data. We can also often have multiple topics contained in one single tool, meant that we have to provide context. This can often be confusing because it's not just focused on one specific thing. And our input sources can be really varied. We know that we can have broad spatial scales, we can have different times. There can be a lot of different things going on here. So it is essential for us to understand these data in order to use them accurately. Now, a mapping tool can look like a lot of different things. It could look like a story map. A story map can be really great. It's really visually pleasing, but there's not a lot of ability to do things like manipulate data. But there are lots of words in context. So a lot of times this might be a communication type tool. Your data exploration maps. Now, this might have some ability to change and manipulate what data are shown. You can turn off layers, able to do some comparisons of your own. They're generally designed for non-experts, but they still might require some skill level to be able to use them. You need to know what you're being able to manipulate and what comparisons you're making. And then there's things like building your own maps. So this often requires specialized software, and you have to have the skill level required to do that. Now, the good thing is it does provide you the opportunity to fully manipulate and format data in a way that you want to. But not all of us are just like GIS, experts and whizzes. So, understanding what our skill level is and our opportunity here, and then our different types of things are going to help us pick what tools are relevant to us, or if we're going to develop a tool, and who our intended audience are. So they all have a lot of different utility in a place, but just understanding what we can and can't get out of the different types of mapping tools. So I am going to turn this over to my colleague Kiama, where we're going to actually start digging into some tools to show you some of the ones we commonly use here for our resilience work, and how you can actually begin to get that data yourself. All right.
Thank you, Allie. Share my screen. Would be helpful if it was in presenter view. There we go. Nope. One moment. It's deciding which screen it wants to be. The joys of having 3 screens. Okay. Here we go. Screen number 1. Okay, great. Can you see that okay?
Yep, looks good.
Great. All right. So thank you for that intro into tools from Allie. I'm going to dig into a couple of the tools that we use a lot in our line of work and our partners, starting with EPA's EJ Screen, which you heard a little bit about already from Allie. This is that tool that really uses environmental justice combined with demographics and hazards to give information and outputs. We'll also highlight 3 different future flood tools: the Interagency Sea Level Rise Scenario, the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, and a simulated storm surge story map. And then we will switch gears and talk a little bit about the economic impacts of Sea Level Rise Viewer, which also highlights impacts of future storm surge on economics in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And then finally, as there are so many tools, as you can see from today, and also just in general, there's a tool that helps you find other tools. That's called Gulftree. And so that's how we'll end today, with a brief overview of how you can use a tool to help you find the information and other tools that would be relevant to you in your work. So starting with EJ Screen, this is their screening and mapping tool. It's used by the EPA to highlight areas that may need support under their environmental justice work. And really, this tool can help users identify potential areas with environmental quality issues in relation to demographic information. So we've seen this information used to support educational programs. Grant writing is a big one, especially if you're applying to any grants through the EPA, and also general community awareness efforts. What this tool is really good at doing is providing a general assessment, but it should be combined with additional information and local knowledge. It does not provide any detailed risk analysis or assessment. So as the name implies, it should be used as a screening tool to highlight areas to further review. So on the screen is a screenshot from the main page once you enter into the screening and mapping tool. Right there in the middle, where that first green arrow is pointing, is the welcome box. This has links to an overview video, as well as a user guide and other helpful supporting documents that help you orient to where the data comes from, what the data is, and how to navigate the tool in general. This screening tool was recently updated, so you can also find a link that highlights these changes and these new updates and information. You can navigate the map to get to your area of interest by either clicking and dragging the map, or you can use the top right corner. You see that green arrow there is pointing to the search function. You can type in your city, your state of where you want to go to. And then in the bottom left corner, you see the last green arrow is pointing to where you can change the base map. So similar to how you would change satellite view versus road view in Google Maps, you can choose through a couple different base map layers. And so now on the left side, you can see where the different map layers are hosted. You'll notice at the very top, you can make comparisons on either a national scale or a state scale. There are the different layers that show the different environmental and socioeconomic indices. As a reminder, EJ Screen does use percentiles, and percentiles are not the same as percentages, as you heard from Ali earlier. They show how a number compares to other places. So for example, in the top right corner, you can see the legend, and it has the different percentiles and different colors for each of the census blocks. So the first group of data layers that's highlighted here are the different environmental burdens. You can see that includes particulate matter, ozone, nitrogen dioxide, things related to air quality, lead paint, hazardous waste. The drinking water noncompliance is part of the new update. So there's different ones. And as you click on one, it will highlight different colors of the census tracts to see what percentile those tracts are in. The next group of layers is the socioeconomic indicator. So these are your demographic information. Within that, it has the demographic index and the supplemental demographic index that Ali mentioned those earlier. But you can also single out things like people of color, low income, and unemployment rate for whatever you would be interested in. And the environmental justice indices. So this combines one environmental factor with the socioeconomic indices from earlier, specifically two demographic ones, low income and people of color. The supplemental index is one environmental factor with 5 demographics. So those 5 demographics would be low income, unemployment, limited English speaking, less than high school education, and low life expectancy. So depending on what information you're interested in, you would either click on the environmental justice or the supplemental index. Both of those have the same environmental factors. The difference is just how many demographics are being included with them. And so another feature in the top left corner, you can see is the report icon. This can be used to generate a report for a selected area. So you can see in the middle here, I clicked a census tract and it pops up a screen that asks if I want to open an EJ Screen community report. And also you can change these by selecting multiple tracks, if you want to select a city, a county, or just a group. But I chose to go ahead and select one census tract. And then once you've chosen your area, you can see this is a snapshot from the community report. It pulls out a PDF that shows you your areas that you highlighted, and it shows the socioeconomic and environmental indices in graph format in an easy way that breaks down the information for all of that area. So it's a nice way to get a good summary that's pretty easily understood and can be shared with others. So it's one that definitely takes some playing around in to see what all the different data layers are and what the different environmental factors are for different areas. And this is a nationwide tool, so you can use it anywhere for the United States. So moving on to some flood risk tools. This is the Interagency Sea Level Rise Scenario Tool, which contains updated sea level rise science from the 2022 technical report. It can be used to find global, regional, and local sea level rise projections out to the year 2150 for all coastal United States and territories. So users can click on the grid closest to the area of interest to pull up 5 different scenarios. Here on the left side panel, you can see where you could explore the global projections and also regional projections. But since we're interested in local levels, we'll be using the closest tide gauge for our information. So here in Biloxi, Mississippi, our closest tide gauge that we use for this information is on Dauphin Island, Alabama. That's the blue dot that's being pointed to by the green arrow. By clicking on that tide gauge, it'll take you to the sea level rise projections for the area. It also shows the historic data for this tide gauge. So since this tide gauge has at least 50 years of historic data, it can show an additional projection based on that data that extrapolates out to the year 2050. That's what that green arrow is pointing to. It's the observation extrapolation. You can see that when you click on there. That's the topmost projection of this lighter pink line. So this isn't the case everywhere in the United States, but especially here in the Northern Gulf, you might notice that our observation extrapolation is higher than the high sea level rise projection. And this has been observed in multiple areas in the Northern Gulf. So there is current ongoing research to identify what processes in the Gulf of Mexico are contributing to this acceleration of sea level rise, but it is a unique problem that we are facing here. Additionally, this is the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer. So this gives users a preliminary idea of what potential flooding will look like, and the data is available nationally again. It also identifies areas that often experience high tide flooding, and something that we've used the tool before too is to look at ways that inundation will connect existing waterways in the future with sea level rise. So this is the main page of the Sea Level Rise Viewer. You see the map of the United States. On the left side is an interactive panel. On the top, where the first green arrow is pointing, you'll see a search bar to zoom into your specific area of interest. And the bottom left green arrow is pointing to our Sea Level Rise Viewer slider. So this slider is used to input the amount of sea level rise you want to view, and the map then shows the relative inundation above the mean, higher high water, so the highest average water level. It also identifies areas that often experience high tide flooding as you click through the different sections on the left panel. The one thing to know about the slider bar is that it is currently in 1 foot increments, so there is no half measures. You have to go by 1 feet, starting at 1 feet up to 10 feet, and you can switch between centimeters and feet. So while using this tool, it's helpful to think about how much sea level rise we want to view. You know, if you put this in front of some people, they like to crank the sea level rise all the way to 10 feet, but that's not very helpful when it comes to planning and projects. So it would help to have some guidance. So we can pull up those local scenarios that we looked at in the interagency sea level rise tool and use that in correspondence with this tool. So by clicking the local scenarios tab on the left panel, we can then highlight the tide gauges. And as I said before, our closest tide gauge to Biloxi is Dauphin Island. So in the top right corner, that green arrow is pointing to the tide gauge icon. They're represented by those blue icons. By clicking on that, this allows us to see how much rise is expected between 2020 and 2100 for each sea level rise projection. And then we can match our slider bar to see how the water level changes under each scenario. So I have highlighted here the high scenario that shows you the different expected sea level rise projections for the different years. And then you can move the slider bar to the nearest water level for each of those designated years. Once again, it does not have half-foot increments, so you do have to just move it to the next closest one. And finally, for our flood risk tools, this tool is located in the Coastal Dynamics of Sea Level Rise Simulated Storm Surge Story Map. So we heard a little bit about story maps from Allie. This story map uses historic hurricane data to estimate what storm surge will look like by the year 2100 under 4 different sea level rise scenarios. And this tool, we use this is specifically information for the northern Gulf of Mexico, so coastal Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida Panhandle. And this tool is really useful for assessing the vulnerability of areas to storm surge and seeing how that vulnerability changes with increased sea level rise. So it's important to read the side descriptions for each of the maps because it is a story map. So as you scroll down, the panels will change. But this story map shows different information like surge by storm surge maximums, and still water storm surge. Once again, this data is only available for the northern Gulf of Mexico region. And so here is one of the panels that we use a lot. This is surge by storm. And so you can see 4 maps of simulated storm surge in hurricane conditions similar to that of Hurricane Katrina. So this first square that's being highlighted by the red box, this shows surge with 0.7 feet of sea level rise, which is what we consider today's standards, and is the main map that you would use for navigation. So you would use that first map to zoom in, move around, get to the area you want to go, and the other 3 maps will follow. Related to that storm surge information from the same research source is the economic impacts of sea level rise data viewer, which similarly, because that storm surge data is just for the northern Gulf of Mexico, so is this data. So this is a website that starts with a story map again, which on the opening page that gives background information on the research and the tool itself. It also links to the research paper and the data resources, so you are able to download the data yourself if you are GIS savvy and choose to do so. This is the first page after the story map. It is the changing floodplains, and this shows you similar information that we just saw from the previous storm surge story map, just in another area where you can see the different sea level rise scenarios and what that storm surge data looks like for each of those. Then users can click through 4 different sections to explore socioeconomic impacts of flooding due to sea level rise. These 4 sections are buildings, people, roads, and essential facilities. So for each of them, there is information about what % annual flood chance event is being used for this data. In this case, we're looking at impacts to roads, and that's the 1% annual chance flood event. Additionally, there is a hexagon here. Each of the hexagons, if you click on it, it takes you to a short overview of where the data on that page comes from and a brief summary of what that data looks like for the full northern Gulf of Mexico. As you scroll down, you can see that there's a link to read more from the publication and also to download the data. There's another hexagon here with an eye icon. That's for if you want to link to some videos that help with data or navigation of the map below. And then the map here, this is where we're going to focus on. This is where we're going to get our information. So using the maps on this page, we can use impacts in our area of choice and see how these impacts change with different levels of sea level rise. So you can click on one or several hexagons to get a summary report of the impacts of the area. So let's see what that looks like. So here I am zoomed into Gulf Shores, and our first green arrow here is pointing to the select tool. So you can use this to select multiple hexagons that overlap with your area of interest, which is where you want to get your detailed information. You can see they have the different sea level rise scenarios here. As I said before, 0.7 feet is what we consider our current conditions. So I want to know what sea level rise looks like with 1.6 feet and how that affects the economic impacts. Down below that is the map legend, which shows you the different road exposure costs related to their color. And then this blue bottom bar here, this shows information based on all of the hexagons that are within the viewing window. So of all the hexagons included in the map currently, this is the road exposure cost, and this is the length of road exposed. But I have here selected 8 hexagons to learn more information about. Now, this green area is pointing to view selected data summary. When I click on that, it brings me this helpful summary bar that shows me the length of road damage and road exposure costs for each of the sea level rise scenarios. So for this area and the hexagons I selected, it's 1 mile of road that increases to 38 miles of road with 1.6 feet of sea level rise. Similarly with road exposure costs, you can see it jumps up from 641,000 to over 25 million. And finally, users can use the build report section to generate an infographic report or a table report with summary data for your selected area. And this will show you information for all 4 of those economic impacts. This map does not feature any data layers, as you can see, so that's why it's important to explore the information first in whatever tab you so choose. That's why we looked at the road tab first. So I know what area I want to look in now in Gulf Shores. I'm going to zoom into that area, select the hexagon, same as we did before. Then by clicking the infographic report, it brings up a map of my area, and then it generates these infographic graphs to show summaries of how, for in this case, this shows the residential buildings at risk to future flood and how that increases in a graph format across the different sea level rise scenarios. You can also choose to have a table summary report. It shows the same information, but in a different format. And once again, these summaries will give you all 4 of the economic impacts all together in a report that you can then print or save as a PDF. And finally, Gulftree, which stands for Tools for Resilience Exploration Engine. This is a decision support filter-based search engine. So as we've talked about, there are a lot of tools out there, many more than we have time to go over in this one training. By using this filter-based interactive guide, users are able to identify climate tools that best suit their needs. So for first-time users, there is a guided search option that walks us through the filtered search process. That's what that green arrow is pointing to there, Guide My Search. After clicking on that, you'll be taken through a series of questions to help find a tool that matches your search filter. So first, you would select what the tool function you're looking for. And secondly, you would select the topic area that you're seeking information for. So note that some of the topic areas have drop-down menus as shown by the example here. You're able to select as many topics as you'd like, but it is best to limit your topics maybe to 1 or 2 different topic areas, so you can actually filter some of these tools to what is most useful to you. Next, you'll want to tell it what location you're looking for a tool to work in. Not every tool will work for every region. So you can select on each state's drop-down menu to see a list of every county and individually select single or multiple counties that you're wanting a tool to work with. You can also select all or shoreline to automatically select every county in the state or just the coastal counties. And then lastly, you'll need to select the level of effort you're willing to put into using a tool and the tool cost. For level of effort, it's low, medium, high. Tool cost, most tools on Gulftree are free. However, there are some tools that have associated fees to operate or access the tool. And so finally, with all that information put in, the next page shows you how many tool matches on Gulftree match the search criteria. So you can see all your tool matches on the results page, which is what's shown here. You can also see your currently active search filters across the top of the screen here. You can click on a tool match to be taken to that information page that contains more detailed information about each tool. The different colors are the different types of tools. You can also go back and adjust your search filters to find additional options by clicking where the screen arrow is pointing to change your top filters. Or you can start a new search by clicking the blue Guide My Search button again, and it'll take you back to those questions. So as I said, the primary use of this tool is to help narrow down what is out there and what is available to what could actually be useful for you and your needs, depending on your level of expertise, location that you're trying to work in, and how much time and effort it takes to use the tool. So it's a very helpful one. And so those are the tools that we are highlighting for today. So I would like to thank you all again for joining us for our Coast Resilience Institute training. Now that was a lot of information. So here are the emails for myself and Allie. If you have any additional follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Also, as part of follow-up for this, I will be sending out an email with worksheets for all of the tools that we talked about today. They provide some more in-depth details about each of the tools, as well as some guidance as you're moving through them, selecting and playing around and trying to find data. So I'll be sending all of that in a follow-up email, as well as a recording of this training. So once again, thank you for joining us and hope you have a great rest of your day.